Okay, it's time to commit. 2024 is the year for prioritizing yourself. Begin your new smile journey with Byte, and you could start seeing results in just 2 to 3 weeks. Just order your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95 at Byte.com. Byte clear liners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces, plus they offer financing options, accept eligible insurance, and you could pay with your HSA, FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast with Phil Sanchez. Unfiltered.
And welcome to a special edition of the All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. I'm Garrett Bergquist, and joining us is Democratic candidate for governor Jennifer McCormick. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So our goal for these podcast interviews is to help voters understand what shaped the candidates into who they are and what they stand for today. So you grew up on a family farm in Newcastle. Tell me a little bit about that.
I did. We were right outside of Newcastle city limits, and we really lived a couple roads over, and then at the age of 10, we actually built a home and moved to the family farm, and we did not have a bunch of critters other than a lot of barn cats, and we did have a raccoon and a dog, and we had some interesting pets, but we had crops, and so I have since returned to that same farm, and my dad is living with us, but yeah, that's where I grew up in the Henry County area.
What are some things from your upbringing that you think really stuck with you?
Well, obviously hard work. I mean, my dad was a big one on hard work. My mom was also very big in making sure that we were well-rounded, so I had the best of both worlds. My mom was full of energy. She died around 10 years ago, but I took the best of both my mom and dad. But that hard work piece was huge, making sure that we were taking care of others. Our family was very philanthropic, and so I grew up in a household that was inspired by that and expected that, so always making sure we're being good servants to others was the way our house operated.
So your background is in education. How did you first get started in it?
Yeah, so when I left in high school, I had an opportunity to help students with peers actually with special needs, and really probably didn't understand the impact to the level I do now, and then went to Purdue, and I thought I was going to study elementary education, and I did, and then really enjoyed every minute of that, and then got into working when I left school. It was a time when there weren't any jobs, and so it was very, very different than it is now with the teacher shortage. So I started working at a youth center, and part of it was the kids, young people were incarcerated. The other side, they were placed there for different reasons, and so it was probably the best opportunity I ever had. But because of that, I got very interested in special education, and so I went back to school and taught gen ed, special ed, taught it both, and had a great 10 years of teaching.
Just tell me a little bit more about that. First off, working in the youth center and all the things that you learned from working there.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was in the Henry County Youth Center. It was a new facility. It was beautiful. There were a lot of young people that I was friends with that worked there. We had some amazing supervisors that were very patient with all of us. But we had to learn to work as a team. We had to learn to really take care of, kids as individuals, and they had a whole lot going on in their lives. And we became very close to them because we were with them, the students, a lot. And so they went to school, they had recreational time, they had unsupervised and supervised time. We were with them through their meals and just learned a lot about making sure we were being good listeners, but also too making sure we were being very direct in our expectations. But as far as how we worked together at the youth center, it was very much a team effort. I remember a lot of stories too where kids would have their parents or their grandparents say they were going to come visit them on weekends, and so the whole week they were awesome because they could not wait for a family member to visit them, and it was a big deal, and some of them came from multiple counties away, and so for someone to come visit them, they were ready to go, and so they they were always like, hey, can you help me see if I can get a haircut? And they just wanted to look good, and they felt good. Their spirits were high, and sometimes those folks didn't always show up. And so it was devastating. And so it was a rough week the entire next week and the next week, because obviously they were, very upset and sad and frustrated and mad. And so all those emotions came in. But I learned a lot about the family dynamics and just making sure with that follow through, but understanding that their families had a whole lot going on. The young kids had a whole lot going on. And I learned a lot from the whole experience. I worked there for about a year before I got a teaching job in more of a traditional setting, but it was really probably the best training I had in discipline, and just making sure we're consistent, but also making sure that we're very respectful of the kids that we serve.
And so you got into teaching, and then you worked your way up to a school system superintendent. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I taught at Yorktown eventually, and loved every minute of it. I taught at West Dell, which is another small school in Delaware County, and then eventually at Yorktown. And then after the 10 years of teaching, I thought, well, maybe I want to be an administrator. So I became an elementary principal, which I still argue today is the best job in the world. Loved every bit of that. It was a 3 through 5 building, so I went from teaching 6th grade to a 3 through 5 principal. That was really my first experience, other than my experience at Purdue, with the elementary level, and then served in that capacity. And I had a board come to me and say, hey, we're looking at an assistant superintendent. What do you think? I'm like, sure. It was curriculum, and it was over instruction and assessment, and had a great experience with that. And then went eventually on to become a superintendent, same district, and served in that capacity for 7.5 years.
What do you think are the biggest lessons that you took away from your time first teaching in a classroom setting, and then moving up into your time as elementary principal, then eventually superintendent of that school corporation?
Yeah, I had a lot of great supervisors, bosses. I learned a lot of good things from folks. I also learned from those that sometimes weren't the best, but I was very blessed with a lot of great people to work with, whether it was peer teaching or whether it was our supervisors, our school board. I had amazing students. I had amazing families that were extremely supportive, and all those lessons, as far as taking that with me to that every level that I went, I took it with me, as far as making sure you are being a good listener, and making sure that you're going out of the way to be a good communicator, and making sure you're being fair and consistent. I never cared what family I was dealing with and what the background of the family was. If the rules were broken and we needed to deal with it, I was very fair and I was very consistent. And so, but I had high expectations at every single level. As a teacher, whether I was teaching special ed or regular gen ed 6th grade, I always had expectations that were high, and I pushed all the kids. I felt like I did them no favors to bring that rigor down. So I carried that on as a principal. We had high expectations as far as the discipline in the building. We had high expectations about academic performance, and we had high expectations about we were all going to take care of each other and have a good time while we were there, and boy, we did. And so, and took that on to the level, the superintendent level as well. And I felt it was more of a team effort, and we worked very collaborative, and I was just very fortunate with the people I worked with. We had an amazing community around us.
So now let's fast forward to 2016. You ran for superintendent of public instruction as a Republican. That was still an elected office at the time. Tell me about your experience as the state's superintendent of public instruction.
Yeah, and I had no aspirations to be a political person. I didn't even know where to buy yard signs. I had no idea what I was doing as far as running a campaign, but I was a local superintendent. I was paying attention to what was happening at the Department of Education. It was really hard. And so I thought, well, I can either complain or be part of the solution. And so there were a group of people, and we were like, who's going to run? Who's going to try this just to bring a solution? I felt it was important for whoever was in that position to make sure that they had been a superintendent, because it's so complex, and I felt like some of that was falling through the cracks, and it was hard at the local level. And so I decided to run. I did run as a Republican. I took with me at the time, I was very fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative, call it what you want. I still am. I believed in empowering people. I believed in opportunities for for others. And so got into office, got elected with a lot of help, I think, at the time from the federal level. I mean, I think a lot of us had help that year. But I also learned a lot during that campaign that I'm utilizing now, even running as a Republican. It's totally different from what running as a Democrat. So, but I do take away a lot of those lessons learned. But I'm glad I did it when I did it, and it was just for public service and trying to be part of a solution. It's the same reason I'm doing it now.
What was it like working with the legislature at that time?
It was really interesting. So there were, we were the Ellis Island of the State House. So we were committed to working across the aisle. And when I got elected, I really believed in serving kids. And I didn't ask the kids, hey, are your families Republican or Democrats? Are you independents? What are you? I was elected to serve over 1 million kids, and we did that, and we did it well. I was also there to serve families and communities. And so that approach, when you have a supermajority and one-party rule, can be quite hard. So we opened our doors up. We worked with all legislators. We were helping with policy, whether that was a Democrat or Republican, whether they had questions, whether we were crafting language and trying to get someone to take it and bite on it and go with it. But it was tricky, but I learned a lot of lessons doing that as well that will serve me well when I become the governor.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What are some things that you really took away from that 4-year term you served as the state's final elected SPI?
Yeah, I could try to unlearn what I learned or do something with it. And so my choice is to do something with it. I learned a lot during that time. I learned a lot about how important it is to stay true to your values, which I did. I did not let a party overtake who I am, and so I stayed true to myself. I also learned and stayed true to it's always about people before a political party, and it will always be for me. We're there to serve people. We're not there to serve a political party or one particular person. And so those were the most valuable lessons. Also, too, the needs of Indiana are vastly different. And although we have some similarities across the state of Indiana, we have some big differences. And a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. And that's why it's so important to include those local conversations in everything we do.
You alluded to this just now. I want to delve into a little bit. Your decision to switch from being a Republican to being a Democrat. Walk me through that process. What drew you to the conclusion that the Republican Party was no longer a place for you?
Yeah, and I mentioned, I stayed true to my values of fiscally conservativeness and empowering others and making sure that we're having opportunities for others and that focus on public service. And when I got into office, I just did not see that under the supermajority. Now, I have seen that in local Republicans, but not at the State House. And so I quickly learned this is not for me. I also taught kids for 20 years that their character mattered. And I saw people really getting behind the former president who I questioned his character, and I didn't agree with the way he behaved and sometimes made fun of people and just did not take that office seriously, and for me it was problematic. And so I stayed true again to my values, and when I did not see those reflected in the party, I switched parties.
Do you find, as you're campaigning now as the Democratic nominee for governor, that your status as a Republican turned Democrat is a bit of a problem when you're talking to people? People look at you and say, well, I don't know if I can trust you because you're a Johnny-come-lately?
Yeah, no, I actually find the opposite. So when I'm at events, I have a lot of people showing up to our events right now, standing room only at a lot of them, and a lot of them are like, I'm you. I was a Republican. I'm not going to have anything to do with that. I'm done now. And so I've switched parties. Or I'm a Republican. I'm not ready to switch parties, but I'm not getting behind what's going on with the Republican Party right now. So I feel it to be somewhat, people can relate with that in Indiana. I also have a lot of Democrats that are very like, oh, thank God you saw the light, and they're happy about it. And independents that are like, I understand. I understand how, you could be fiscally conservative and watch the waste happening at the State House and be uncomfortable with that, or how you could teach kids for years that character mattered. So it's really been a benefit to me. I think people in Indiana, we have a lot of shared values, and that is we respect people for the most part. We believe in family, and people are very committed to their faith for the most part. I think people are very committed to their friends and their family. And so when you have that, people are respectful, but you try to find those pieces that you have in common more so than those differences. And so I find it to be extremely helpful.
So I want to turn to the campaign. Why did you choose to make education such a central theme to your campaign?
Yeah, well, it's central Indiana. We're over half of the state budget. K-12 education is expensive, and it's not just about K-12. It's about childcare. It's the system, childcare, the lack of universal pre-K, then K-12, and then post-high school. And, if we are uneducated as a state, it's not sustainable. So two of my top three pillars, the healthcare, the education, then obviously good paying jobs, a strong economy. If we are educated and we're healthy as a workforce, our economy will be strong. And as if we're educated and healthy as a consumer, our economy will be strong and our state will be strong. And so education is incredibly important to everything we do. It keeps us healthy. It keeps us successful. It's our quality of life. Really everything revolves around it, including crime and things that are very expensive in our state. But that education piece, one, I'm passionate about it, but two, I believe in it. It is such an avenue out of poverty. It's such an avenue out of that crime piece. It's such a pivotal piece in making sure that we are putting people in a trajectory to be successful.
Speaking of education, just this week as we record this, the Indiana Department of Education has made some pretty significant changes to the proposed new high school diplomas. A lot of educators were very concerned about the way the originally planned GPS and GPS Plus diplomas were laid out. Did IDOE's changes solve your concerns about it?
I think it's interesting that we are doing this again. So, every about 3 years, Indiana, or 4 years, we're trying to reinvent high school, and it's exhausting. And so we don't know what works, what doesn't work, because we've changed it so much. But when we were given this charge, when I was in office in 2019, we came up with a plan that looks very similar to the last part that they came out with this week. And so, yes, they're getting closer. It's not identical, but it's pretty darn close. Our charge was rigor, making sure it's an approach where kids can have a well-rounded education, but also, too, that they're eligible to get into our universities if they choose to, or into a skilled trade. So there were a lot of pieces to it that it got it closer. I was happy to see what it was, but really it mimics a lot of what we came up with in 2019. It just took them 6 years to accept it, which is also unfortunate because you have kids moving through. But I think it's getting us closer. This could have all been avoided on the front end with conversations with practitioners and the universities and business, and I'm sure there was some of that, but clearly not enough. And so that goes right back to when the State Board of Education and the Secretary of Education, the Department of Education fall under the umbrella of the governor. He's responsible, and when I am elected, that is not going to happen.
You've been making a play for the center throughout this campaign. Do you ever fear that you'll lose more progressive voters in the process? Because the party bases in both cases tend to consist of the most loyal voters being the ones that tend to be very progressive or very conservative, depending on which party we're talking about.
Yeah, we're doing well with both, honestly. Like the more progressive folks and some of their agenda, we agree with that. But some of the center, obviously we're doing well with them. We are staying true to restoring women's reproductive rights and freedoms, and that hits home in the center. It hits home on the right actually as well, but also on the more left. And so those progressive, really want women's rights and freedoms restored. Education's hard to argue no matter where you are on that continuum, and a good paying job. So, but we don't shy away from some of those more social issues as far as, I am a champion for LGBTQ. I have family and friends who are impacted, and I believe and respect them, and they have their rights and freedoms, and we need to take care of all Hoosiers, and all means all. And so, there are other issues, environmental issues, that sometimes people seem to think it leans more to the left. But when you're talking about water, just a very basic natural resource, again, I'm finding interest in water and air and in soil conservation across the aisle, and no matter in that big continuum. So I think that continuum has more shared concerns now than maybe in the past, but we're finding a lot of momentum just across the board.
You unveiled your tax plan on August 15th. Why did you decide to include a mix of expansions of income tax deductions and property tax rather than focusing on the property tax issue?
Because we were looking for a realistic solution. And to do that in Indiana, you have to look broader. And so that's what we did. We also wanted to approach it in a way that was bipartisan. And on day one, it could get passed and have instant $600 million relief for Hoosiers. So we also did not want to hammer our local governments. It's not fair to defund the police or the fire or schools or go after our farmers and make them take the bulk of the responsibility or renters or seniors. And so we tried to look at a more balanced approach that everybody would gain something, maybe not as much as they wanted to, but it's such a complex issue that we were looking for. This is just one piece of a much bigger conversation that needs to happen. But again, bipartisan, we didn't want to burden one particular or a couple particular groups, including the local level, and we wanted it to be passable day one, and we came up with a plan that very much is.
How do you plan to make up the lost revenue from those tax measures, considering that under your plan, most of the burden for that lost revenue would fall on the state?
Yeah, and so we knew at the local level our towns and cities are really, really struggling, and so many of them has signaled, and I think the state level knows this, that some of them are really struggling and they don't have the money to take away from them or to continue to burden them at the public service level that is so important to our quality of life. So the onus being on the state is just a shift to the state level. First of all, people have said you're going to deplete the surplus. We're not depleting the surplus. We have a $22 billion-ish around there a year budget, and we can find the $600 million if we're going to prioritize. So it's about priorities, and I feel like that is not that big of a lift. And what I love about it is the Republicans obviously didn't either, because when they put much of that through, that fiscal impact was studied from the LSA. And so in addition to Buchanan and Holdman and Judy, and then obviously Godora on the Democratic side, a lot of that combination. But for me, it's about prioritizing. It's a big budget. So relatively, we're going to have to cinch our belts and prioritize and find the money to give some relief to folks.
How would you work with the legislature if you are elected and the legislature remains in Republican hands, especially considering that here in Indiana it only takes a simple majority to override a veto?
Yeah, so we're going to break that supermajority, and we're going to be down to a majority. I have all the faith in the world in that, but it's still a majority. So we need 4 seats. We'll still be dealing with a majority of Republicans, but finding common ground. I know when I was in the State House, when I needed to talk about something to try to find common ground in mental health, there were a lot of Republicans who didn't feel like that was a Hoosier issue. That was more of a home issue. So I would have to go find Kreider or Head or someone who would champion for that, and we would have great conversations. And I knew when I was wanting to talk about dyslexia, who I needed to go talk to about who was passionate about reading, or cursive writing when I needed to talk to someone about, hey, let's think about this a minute. You target those legislators that you get to know them and their passions, and having been there will be extremely beneficial. Also, my lieutenant governor, having served 20 years, is also very beneficial because he's got relationships with many of them and will work right across that aisle in order to get things done. So all of that plays into, in order to work in a bipartisan fashion. And we have said from day one, it's about common sense, civility, and bipartisanship. And unlike my opponent, who really has dug his heels into just that one-party rule, I just don't think it's a healthy thing for Indiana. We need a balance. And so we need to get the majority in the House, and we need to get some offices, executive offices at the State House as well.
I want to stay on that topic for just a little bit. You've said that restoring reproductive freedoms is one of your top priorities. Mm-hmm. How would you work with the legislature on that, especially considering that you would be working with many of the very state lawmakers who wrote Indiana's current abortion ban?
Yeah, and I'm very concerned about the Braun-Beckwith team, who has signaled they didn't go far enough in Senate Enrolled Act 1, which is frightening, because if you're going to tighten that up to even further bans, or you're going to go after birth control or IVF, that's just government getting in a place in our family planning and in our healthcare where they don't belong. They need to mind their own business. And so for us, it's about doing what we can with the governor's authority, which I know it's limited in Indiana in a lot of ways, but also finding those bipartisan commonalities to fight to keep birth control access, to expand those OBGYNs, where right now a third of our counties do not have access to OBGYNs, have an honest conversation about healthcare access for women, where so many of our counties have shut down small hospitals or clinics, and like, how do we find the care if we're going to want to be preventative, and just having an honest conversation about the healthcare piece of it. Also looking at the boards and commissions and the agencies in which I appoint and making sure that is those are reflective of the Hoosier voice, and more than half have signaled they support women having the option. And it's so personal. We're not telling women what to choose. We're just saying you have a choice, and there's a difference. And making sure that if your life is threatened, that you can work with your healthcare provider, having those conversations with whoever you want to bring in. Your own faith plays into that decision. So again, we're not telling people this is how you should choose about this topic, but you have a choice if your health care is dependent upon it.
Should Indiana go back to having an elected superintendent of public instruction?
I'm realistic, and that's not going to happen under the supermajority, but I do see benefits. It was a voice for Hoosiers, and right now I see the benefits of you would have an independent office who could have spoken out about the debacle that happened before it got to this level, or maybe the thumb wasn't as heavy over that office. I don't know. I've not talked to Dr. Jenner, but that's the difference in having a voice that you can get out front and independently own versus having the governor be responsible. So in a lot of ways, it's unfortunate that Indiana doesn't have that as a separately elected official, because that is one more avenue to voice. We do not have, ballot initiatives that we can vote on. Now we do not have that. We do not have any votes into the State Board of Education. So really it's the governor. So if people are passionate about education, hopefully they will vote for an educator as their governor.
Dr. Jennifer McCormick is the Democratic nominee for governor. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast with Phil Sanchez. Unfiltered, in-depth, nonpartisan coverage, exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.